The story begins by showing a man named Dan Morgan. Dan works in a showroom, and his colleagues are very happy with him because he convinces customers with his words to visit Lamborghini.com. Dan was about to go out with his wife, Jessica, but Kyle says that he stopped gaming because of his father. However, today he is going to a friend's house, so his younger sister Nina takes responsibility. Here, we find out that both children hide a lot from their dad. For example, Nina stopped reporting because of her boyfriend, while Kyle is a well-known gamer, and their father is unaware of this. Meanwhile, Dan and Jessica go to a park, enjoy themselves, reminisce about their old days, and even kiss each other. Just then, some mischievous boys take their pictures. Dan asks them to delete the photos, but they don't. Instead, they post them on social media. One boy even pours his drink over Dan, insulting him, but Dan says nothing and goes home, although he felt very bad about it. The next day, Jessica is practicing in her boxing class, where she meets a girl named Gwen. They become friends, and Gwen tells Jessica that she is very troubled by her ex-boyfriend. Jessica shares that she loves her family very much, especially her husband Dan, but she is also stuck because she loves traveling, while Dan never takes her anywhere. However, Jessica has now made peace with her situation. Meanwhile, Dan arrives at the mall to shop with his baby when a man attacks him. Dan bravely confronts the man to protect himself and his child, like a martial arts player and a brave wrestler. As soon as he reaches home, Dan takes out weapons and some money from a secret place and puts them in a bag. He also checks the passports of all family members, which were now outdated, meaning they had expired. Dan calls a friend and asks him to delete all the digital traces of him and his family because Mac has found out where they are. In reality, Dan is not just an ordinary man, and we will learn the truth about him a little later. For now, we see Dan packing all the items, checking the chart, and figuring out where his children might be at the moment. Dan first goes to Nina's class, where he finds out that Nina had quit reporting 3 months ago and is currently hanging out with friends instead of attending class. Dan scolds her and also asks where Kyle is. Nina tells Dan about Kyle, and Dan catches him red-handed, realizing that Kyle was also lying to him. But he doesn't have much time at the moment, so he takes his children to Jessica, who is a physiotherapist and currently at work. Dan tells her that they are going on a family trip to Vegas. Initially, Jessica doesn't believe him because he had never taken the family anywhere before, but then she trusts Dan and happily goes along with him. After this, Dan leaves with his whole family. Just then, he notices some goons following them. Dan cleverly takes a detour, but after a while, the goons are back on their tail. Dan realizes there must be a tracker on the car, so he heads towards a garage, removes the tracker, and attaches it to his friend's car, causing the goons to be misled. Dan safely gets away from there, but on the way, he notices that his family members are posting online. Realizing that this is how Mac tracked them, he takes everyone's phones and throws them under a bridge. Seeing this, the family is quite shocked, but they don't know why Dan is doing all this because they are unaware of Dan's past. In reality, Dan used to be a government agent and worked on covert missions. He worked for a man named Mac who made Dan do illegal things for money. That's why Dan left that life behind and was living in Vegas, hiding his identity. Meanwhile, Mac and his goons reach Dan's house, and Mac breaks Dan's family photo. Mac's tracker tells him that he will find Dan through social media. Dan goes to a shop to buy a map and purchases it with money. He also rents 2 rooms at a lodge. When Dan goes outside, he sees a girl taking a photo with Kyle because she was his fan. Dan asks the girl if she will upload it on social media, to which she says yes. Hearing this, Dan lies to his family, saying that there are no rooms available here, so they are going somewhere else. It was quite late, so everyone put on earphones and slept in the car, except for Dan. Then Dan notices some people keeping an eye on him, and they start following him in cars. Dan brings each of them close and takes care of them one by one. The next morning, Dan reaches his daughter's boarding school, where Nina goes to meet her boyfriend because he lived there. Jessica says that he might have moved out by now, but Nina insists on going anyway. Before she goes, they all walk around the school campus, where Dan notices a man staring at him for a long time. Dan cleverly brings him into a room, but this man turns out to be just an ordinary person. As they are talking, a real goon comes in and attacks Dan, but Dan defeats him and goes back to his family. Nina goes to meet her boyfriend and is saddened to see that he already has a girl in his room, meaning he was cheating on her. Nina, crying, returns to the car, where Dan, seeing her in tears, tells her that he had taught her a move that can inflict pain without causing injury. Hearing her father's words, Nina goes back to her boyfriend's room. Nina tries the move her father taught her and also curses her boyfriend. Doing this makes her feel much better. She happily returns to her family, and Jessica tells Dan that he is truly amazing. Then the whole family arrives at a big hotel in Vegas, where Dan tells the kids to stay in the room while he and Jessica go to the casino. Actually, Dan's friend had made new passports for his family, and now Dan was going to tell his wife the whole truth about who he was and what was going to happen next. However, as soon as Jessica and Dan leave, Kyle and Nina also take their little brother to a nearby gaming event where a gaming competition is about to take place, and Kyle participates in it. Meanwhile, Dan enjoys a date with Jessica, and a waiter talks to them in French. Dan responds in French, which surprises Jessica, and she asks him to say more in French. Dan then reveals the truth in French, but Jessica doesn't understand anything. Later, they go to their room, where someone starts shooting at Dan from outside, and a goon grabs Jessica in the room. The goon tells Dan that first his wife will die, then the kids at the gaming event, but Dan says no one will die and takes down the goon with a single strike. Then they both head to the gaming event and are happy to see the kids are safe. Dan takes his children and tells them that he used to be a killer. His kids laugh, but just then, some goons start firing at them. Dan protects his family, kills the goon, and takes them to a cheap hotel. At the hotel, Dan reveals the truth to his family. His mother died when he was young, so he joined the army. Later, he met a man named Mac and started working with him because he thought Mac was killing bad people. But eventually, Dan realized that Mac was taking contracts to kill good people, so he left Mac. However, by then, he had already killed 40 people and now Mac's goons are looking for him. That's why Dan got passports for his family so they could leave the country and go to a safe place. But after hearing Dan's truth, Nina, Kyle, and even Jessica don't believe him. They refuse to accept anything he says and leave. Jessica calls Gwen, asking her to leave with her family, and Dan overhears the conversation. The next morning, the entire family leaves Dan alone. Jessica meets Gwen, who arrives with a private jet to take her and her children. Jessica tells Gwen that she had a fight with her husband. Gwen shares that she was nearby, so she came. She also reveals that her ex-boyfriend left her for another girl. Gwen met that girl to find out what was so special about her that he left Gwen. Eventually, Gwen met the girl and now has her trapped. Jessica realizes that Gwen is talking about her. Just then, Mac arrives, revealing that it was all part of his trap. Mac calls Dan, and we learn that Dan's real name is Sean. Mac tells him that his entire family is under their control and that if he wants them to be safe, he should come over. Dan, loving his family dearly, goes to the address given by Mac. Mac asks him how he is, to which Dan responds, "I am fine, Dad." Hearing this, Dan's family is shocked, and Mac reveals that he is their grandfather. Mac then tells Dan that he has killed everyone who came after him, but if he wants to save his family, he must work for him again. Dan agrees for the sake of his family, and they are released. As they leave, Nina and Kyle say that their dad is the best dad in the world and that they shouldn't leave him alone. Jessica then mentions that the baby has pooped, and she throws the diaper in the face of one of Mac's men, knocking him out of the building. Meanwhile, Gwen clings to Dan, saying that he belongs to her. Dan pretends to love her and knocks her out when he gets the chance. Jessica and the kids arrive, and Dan promises that from now on, he will not lie and will be a good husband and father. Kyle finds a drone, and Mac realizes that one of his men is missing. Dan tells Kyle that he needs his help to locate the goons using the drone. The whole family then starts taking down the goons. First, there is an explosion in the elevator, and then Dan begins throwing the goons one by one off the building. Jessica and the kids are on the roof, and Gwen regains consciousness, making her way to the roof via the elevator. Jessica fights Gwen fiercely on the rooftop. Meanwhile, down below, Mac shoots the drone, and a fight ensues between Mac and Dan. On the rooftop, Jessica ultimately defeats Gwen with a wooden plank. As Mac is about to kill Dan, Jessica arrives with the kids. Nina distracts Mac with her words, giving Dan the opportunity to knock Mac out with a stick. The family escapes just as the police arrive. The story then jumps to 6 months later. Mac is in police custody, and Nina covers the news. Dan now gives safety training to people, Jessica trains children in school, and Kyle is finally allowed to game. The story concludes with a happy ending.